"You would throw away everything," the king said, his voice low, "for a boy." "More than that," Danso replied with quiet determination. "I would give my life if it meant protecting him. And if I have to step down from the throne, then so be it." Danso turned on his heel, fully intending to leave, but a sharp command from his father halted him in his tracks. "Guards, escort my son to his quarters. He is to remain there until further notice, and no one is to let him out." Danso's feet pounded the cobblestones, his heart a blur of fear and fury as he sprinted toward the palace gates. Each step echoed with a single name, Wamba. Danso's mind seethed with questions. Where was he? What had his father done? The massive palace gates loomed ahead, and in any other moment they might have been a symbol of his royal life and duty. But now they were the barriers to Wamba's fate. And for a heartbeat, Danso saw himself breaking through them, charging in and confronting his father with the rawness of his desperation. But just as he neared, Danso came to an abrupt halt. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breaths coming in shallow gasps, and yet, even as his feelings sat like stones within him, a familiar voice surfaced in his mind. It was his father's voice, one of the earliest lessons he'd been taught. A prince does not act on emotions. Emotions are the weapons of the powerless. Control is the armor of kings. In the rush of adrenaline and anguish, Danso felt a painful clarity pierce through him. He knew what King Kofi would do if he saw Danso storming in with nothing but rage and love burning in his eyes. He'd only manipulate, mock and twist it against him. Emotion would do nothing to free Wamba. The cool night air filled Danso's lungs as he forced himself to breathe deeply, to still his mind. If Wamba's life depends on me, then I can't afford to be reckless, he thought. With one last lingering look at the gates, he turned away and retraced his steps through the silent streets. After a tense walk, Danso found himself back at the inn. He strode up the narrow stairs toward Wamba's room. He opened the door to find Wamba's guard, gathering up the few belongings scattered around, his expression grave. "Your Highness," the guard said, barely looking up as he stuffed Wamba's clothes into a leather bag. "I was just about to leave for Nigeria to inform King Adebayo and Kwame that Prince Wamba is missing." A cold shiver ran through Danso. If word reached Nigeria, he knew the response would be swift and merciless. The thought of Wamba's fathers, who cherished him as their world, coming to Ghana in search of him with anger in their hearts, was enough to force Danso's hand. "No," Danso said sharply, catching the guard's eye. "There's no need for that. Prince Wamba is safe. He's at the palace now." The guard's expression softened with relief, but his eyes remained questioning. "At the palace?" he echoed. "Then I'll wait here until he returns." "Yes, wait here," Danso replied smoothly, masking the turmoil within him. "I'll bring him back myself soon. There's no reason to worry King Adebayo and Kwame about this. Wamba is safe. Just leave everything to me." The guard nodded, seeming reassured by Danso's confidence. "As you say, Your Highness." Danso gave a curt nod, the tension in his chest easing slightly as he left the room. Wamba's safety and the delicate peace between kingdoms now rested solely on his shoulders. Forcing his feelings back down, he made his way back to the palace, every step a steady beat toward his inevitable confrontation with his father. The grand doors to King Kofi's study loomed before Danso, imposing as ever, a silent witness to years of calculated strategies and ruthless ambition. Danso took a steadying breath, squaring his shoulders as he prepared himself to face the man who held Wamba's fate in his hands. Inside, King Kofi sat at his ornate desk, absorbed in a stack of documents. He barely glanced up when Danso entered, yet a faint, smug smile tugged at the corner of his lips, a silent acknowledgement of the tension between them. "Ah, my son," King Kofi greeted, his voice smooth, almost indifferent. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Danso's gaze never wavered as he closed the door behind him, keeping his tone calm, measured. "I came to ask you directly, where is Wamba?" King Kofi's expression didn't falter, and his eyes glinted with a mixture of amusement and annoyance. "I don't know what you mean," he replied, leaning back in his chair with feigned innocence. "The last I heard, Prince Wamba was safe and sound at school in Sudan. Are you telling me he's somewhere in Ghana? Why, I had no idea." His voice dripped with mock concern. Danso clenched his jaw but kept his composure, refusing to give his father any hint of his emotions. He knew the game King Kofi was playing, a subtle dance of power and manipulation, the kind his father thrived on. "Stop this," Danso said coldly. "You know very well that Wamba is missing, and we both know what happens if his fathers find out he disappeared here." King Kofi chuckled, a low, patronizing sound that sent a surge of anger through Danso. "My dear boy, do you really think I'm foolish enough to kidnap a prince and risk open conflict with Nigeria? No, I would never act so recklessly. After all, why would I want war when peace is so advantageous to us all?" His words were crafted with precision, each one calculated to sow doubt, to pull Danso deeper into a maze of uncertainty. Yet Danso held his ground, his gaze piercing. "If that's the case, then you have nothing to lose by helping me search for him," Danso replied coolly, refusing to be swayed by his father's games. "But we both know you wouldn't just let him go, would you? Not when his existence threatens everything you've tried to mold me into." King Kofi's eyes flashed with something darker, a glimmer of impatience that slipped through his practiced facade. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his tone sharp. "That I would stoop to such measures because of a trivial infatuation?" Danso's eyes narrowed. "You don't need to pretend, father. I know how far you'll go to maintain control, and I know that Wamba threatens that control. Let's not play games here." King Kofi gave a slow, mocking smile, leaning forward with a feigned air of sympathy. "Danso, you're making this far too complicated. Perhaps I should remind you of your own words. Didn't you agree to put an end to this foolishness, or was that just something you said to appease me?" Danso's heart tightened, but he didn't flinch, meeting his father's gaze with steely determination. "I don't regret loving Wamba," he replied evenly, "but I do regret not standing up to you sooner." A flash of something inscrutable crossed King Kofi's face, and for a split second, Danso saw a hint of anger, a restrained bitterness that lurked just beneath the surface, masked by his father's placid smile. "Well," King Kofi said, leaning back with an air of nonchalance, "if Prince Wamba has indeed decided to stay in Ghana for a while, who am I to interfere? Let him enjoy our hospitality, wherever he may be." His tone was casual, almost playful, yet every word was carefully laced with venom. Danso knew his father well enough to understand the underlying threat, but he kept his face impassive, refusing to give King Kofi the satisfaction of seeing his fear. "Thank you for your concern," Danso replied, his voice steady. "I'll see myself out." As he left the study, his mind churned with frustration and uncertainty. His father's words had been as slippery as a blade's edge, leaving him no closer to finding Wamba, yet confirming his worst suspicions. King Kofi's careful denials and veiled threats hinted at one thing: he knew exactly where Wamba was. The darkness surrounded Wamba, solid and unbending, bearing down with an unforgiving force. He lay on a hard, cold surface, his body aching as though he'd been bruised all over. Every attempt to move his arms only tightened the coarse ropes, binding his wrists, chafing his skin with each slight struggle. His thoughts were hazy, his memories fragmented, as if they had been shattered and scattered across his mind. He tried to remember how he'd ended up here. The night at the palace came back in broken pieces, the warmth of Danso's embrace, the promise of meeting later. He had closed his eyes with anticipation, eager to see Danso again. But now that promise felt like a distant echo, a whisper slipping away into the silence of this unknown place. A dull pain throbbed in his head, and Wamba forced himself to breathe slowly, trying to clear the fog clouding his mind. Flashes of movement behind him as he left Danso's room, hurried footsteps, a hand grabbing him from behind. Each memory flickered and faded, leaving him lost in a blur of confusion. But one memory remained, sharp and clear, like a beacon in the darkness. Danso's face, his expression warm and alive, his smile filled with love. "Danso," Wamba's voice cracked, hardly louder than a sigh, and tears pricked at his eyes. The silence of the cell swallowed his words, and the emptiness around him only deepened the ache inside his chest. Danso was out there, waiting at the inn, wondering where he was, fearing the worst. He could imagine Danso's worry, the hurt in his eyes. The thought of disappointing Danso felt like a fresh wound, a sharp, piercing pain that rivaled the aches in Wamba's body. "I'm sorry," he murmured to the empty cell, his voice trembling as the tears spilled over. I didn't want to leave you." The words felt fragile, helpless, but they were all he had left to give, an apology to the shadows that held him captive. He swallowed, his voice caught in his throat, barely keeping his sobs under control. For a moment, Wamba closed his eyes, letting the memory of Danso's face fill his mind, his smile like sunlight breaking through a storm. It was all he had, this memory, a sliver of hope to hold on to in the darkness. And though his body ached and his mind swirled with confusion, he clung to it, a lifeline to keep him from falling completely into despair. Back in his quarters after the tense exchange with his father, the heavy doors closed behind Danso with a muted finality. He leaned against them, feeling the cool press of the wood as if it might steady the storm raging inside him. In the silence of his room, the enormity of everything crashed over him like a wave. His father's smug composure, the uncertainty around Wamba's fate, and the endless game of manipulation and deceit. All he could see was Wamba's face, the face he might never see again, slipping further from his reach with every passing moment. The room felt hollow, foreign. There were traces of Wamba everywhere. A forgotten sock under the table, a set of keys left on the bedside table. Wamba was always forgetting things. Danso stumbled forward, catching sight of the sock, a small, ordinary thing, yet now it felt like an anchor holding him in place. He knelt, picking up the sock, his fingers curling around it as though he could draw Wamba's warmth from its fabric. He brought it to his face, inhaling deeply, searching for any hint of Wamba's scent. The familiar smell flooded his senses, and his body shook with a wave of grief that overwhelmed him, dragging him under like an unforgiving tide. "Wamba!" he choked, his voice cracking under the strain of his emotions. Hot tears traced down his cheeks as he hugged the sock close, clutching it like a lifeline. The memories rushed over him, Wamba's quiet laughter echoing in this very room last night, his voice filled with the kind of warmth and joy that Danso had thought he'd never find. He could almost feel Wamba's hand on his, the steady reassurance in his touch, the way he had stood by him, never wavering, always believing in them despite everything that stood between them. Without Wamba, everything felt pointless. Danso's whole world had tilted off its axis, leaving him stranded in a place he no longer recognized. If anything happened to Wamba, if he was truly gone. Danso felt his own heart falter at the thought. Life without him felt inconceivable, like the sky without stars, the sea without the moon's gentle pull. A sob tore through his chest as he crumpled to the floor, his shoulders heaving. "Please, please be safe," he whispered to the silence, hoping his words might somehow reach Wamba wherever he was. His tears dried slowly, leaving him hollow but resolute. He had to find Wamba. He would search every shadow, turn over every stone in his father's kingdom if he had to. Wamba was everything to him, and no one, not even King Kofi, could take him away. The night stretched on, and as dawn's first light crept through the window, Danso rose, his face pale but determined. He had spent the hours plotting, laying out a plan, his mind sharpening to a fine point. He would be calm, strategic. If he wanted to see Wamba again, he would have to be as cunning as his father, and today he would play that game to its end. Soft beams of morning light slipped through the high palace windows as Danso strode through the corridor, each step deliberate, purposeful. Gone was the boy easily manipulated by his father. This morning he was a prince, an equal at the chessboard, prepared to match his father's every move with one of his own. When Danso reached his father's study, the guards at the door exchanged wary glances. But his face was unreadable, and after a moment they opened the doors for him without question. His resolve wrapped around him like armor as he entered, his expression cold, his eyes steady as they met his father's. King Kofi glanced up, his eyes calculating as he observed Danso's approach. "To what do I owe this early morning audience?" he asked, a hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as though he were toying with a predictable game piece. Wordlessly, Danso closed the door behind him and stepped into the center of the room. His tone was measured, unwavering. "Enough games, father. Tell me what you want in exchange for Wamba." King Kofi's face was impassive, but his eyes gleamed with something sinister. "What makes you think I know where Wamba is?" he replied, his voice dripping with feigned innocence. "We talked about this last night, Danso. It would be foolish to think I'd risk a war with Nigeria over something so trivial." The king's words dripped with mockery, each sentence meant to instill even more uncertainty. But Danso held his ground, keeping his own expression calm. "Trivial?" he repeated coolly, his voice laced with disdain. "No, father, I know you too well. This isn't about Wamba. It's about controlling me." King Kofi chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Is it control or discipline?" he replied, his tone casual yet sharp. "I raised you to uphold this family's legacy, not to disgrace it." "Then tell me your terms," Danso said, his voice firm. "Enough of these veiled threats and games. What do you want in return for Wamba's safety?" King Kofi leaned back, folding his hands together, a pleased smile curling across his lips. "Very well," he murmured, savoring his moment of authority. "Since you insist on speaking hypothetically, let us say that I want you to do what is expected of you as heir to the throne. Marry, produce an heir, and uphold the family name. If you agree to this, then, hypothetically, Wamba may find his way back to safety." Danso's mouth drew into a hard line, but he maintained his composure. He had expected as much, but hearing the words out loud, spoken so casually, filled him with a silent fury. "You mean for me to marry Namadzi, I presume?" King Kofi's smile widened as he shook his head slowly. "Namadzi has proven herself too independent, far too loyal to you, in fact. No, I've chosen someone more appropriate, a young woman from a respectable Ghanaian family who will ensure your focus remains undivided." The air felt thick, charged as Danso took in his father's words. The demand was clear: a wife, a family, a permanent severing of ties with Wamba. Every part of his being recoiled at the thought, but he schooled his expression into calm neutrality. A silence hung between them, fraught with unspoken words. Then Danso did something that caught even his father off guard. He laughed. It was a bitter sound, one that echoed in the grand chamber like the first crack of a storm. "Do you think I'd agree to this?" Danso asked, his voice filled with a scornful defiance he had never dared show his father before. "You'd have me marry someone, build a life on lies, and simply forget the person I love?" King Kofi's amusement quickly shifted to a glint of anger. "And you would forsake your kingdom for a mere boy, your duty to your people, to this family?" "Yes," Danso replied boldly, his gaze unwavering. "If it means keeping Wamba safe, I would give up the throne this very moment. In fact, consider it done. I relinquish my claim." The declaration hit King Kofi like a blow, his composure momentarily faltering. For a brief moment he simply stared, his mask of control slipping to reveal a flicker of disbelief and perhaps fear. "You would throw away everything," the king said, his voice low, "for a boy." "More than that," Danso replied with quiet determination. "I would give my life if it meant protecting him. And if I have to step down from the throne, then so be it. I'll find Wamba myself, and we will live far from your grasp." Danso turned on his heel, fully intending to leave, but a sharp command from his father halted him in his tracks. "Guards!" Within seconds, 2 guards appeared at the door, blocking Danso's exit. King Kofi's face was dark with fury. "Escort my son to his quarters. He is to remain there until further notice, and no one is to let him out." Danso's heart hammered as he looked at his father one last time, but he refused to let his anger show. Instead, he met his father's gaze with the quiet defiance of someone who had already lost everything. "You may imprison me," he said, his voice steady, "but you cannot change my heart." The guards took his arms, pulling him from the room. The last thing he saw was the cold, triumphant gleam in his father's eyes, and he knew with a sinking certainty that both he and Wamba were captives now, their freedom caught in a game of ruthless control. For 2 long days, Danso paced the confines of his chambers, his mind a relentless storm of plans, regrets, and gnawing dread. Every hour that passed without any word of Wamba was an agony that cut deeper than any wound. He tried to push the despair aside, to focus on escape, on strategies to confront his father once more. Yet with each failed attempt to communicate with the guards, his hope waned. By the second evening, Danso's frustration had transformed into a helpless rage. He couldn't stop replaying his decision to lie to Wamba's guard, to keep Wamba's parents in the dark. It was a choice he had made to keep things calm, to avoid sparking a conflict, but now he feared he had only trapped Wamba in a cage of silence. In a final, desperate bid, Danso took pen to paper. His hands trembled as he poured out the truth, pleading for Kwame's help. The letter was a carefully written testament, an urgent cry from one brother to another. He folded it tightly, pressing it into the palm of a trusted guard, a man Danso had once counted as loyal. "Get this to Kwame," he whispered, his voice barely concealing the fear simmering beneath. "Don't let anyone else see it." The guard nodded solemnly, and for the first time in days, Danso felt a flicker of hope. He watched as the guard left, his steps firm, and waited, praying that help would come soon. But hours passed, and the night deepened, swallowing any hope he had dared to feel. The door to his room swung open, and there, standing in the dim light, was King Kofi, his expression dark and victorious. In his hand he held the crumpled letter. Danso's heart sank. "So," King Kofi said slowly, unfolding the letter and holding it up as if examining a trivial thing. "You thought you could go behind my back, reach out to Kwame, and start a war?" "No," Danso whispered, his voice laced with quiet fury. "I thought I could reach someone who cares about Wamba, someone who would actually help." King Kofi's eyes narrowed, and with a slow, deliberate gesture, he held the letter over a nearby candle. Flames licked at the paper, curling its edges into blackened ash, until the words, the last remnants of Danso's hope, were gone. "Enough of this foolishness," King Kofi said, his tone cold. "Your friend is beyond anyone's help, and unless you wish for this to escalate, you will agree to my terms." Danso looked away, refusing to let his father see the fear in his eyes. But as King Kofi stepped toward the door, he paused, glancing back with a taunting smile. "Tick-tock, Danso," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Wamba's time is slipping away." And with that, he was gone, leaving Danso in a silence burdened with terror and helplessness. The morning dawned gray and cold, shedding an ashen light over Danso's room. He sat slumped against the wall, barely registering the shifting shadows as the day slipped by. A hollow ache had taken root in his chest, a despair that felt like it was consuming him from within. When the door opened once more, he didn't bother to look up. His father's visits had become routine, a sick game where King Kofi's taunts clawed at his sanity bit by bit. But today, the sound of something soft hitting the floor at his feet jolted him from his daze. Danso looked down, and his breath hitched. A shirt lay crumpled on the floor, familiar, torn, and stained with dried blood. Wamba's shirt. "Time is running out," King Kofi's voice echoed softly, a sickly calm in his tone. "This accident happened during his first night, you know. He's resilient, but resilience fades." Danso's chest grew taut, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. All he could see was the red-brown stain, the image of Wamba's face flashing in his mind, bruised, helpless, trapped somewhere in the dark. "Where is he?" Danso demanded, his voice barely more than a rasp. But King Kofi's only response was a cold, taunting smirk. "Do you think you can demand anything of me?" Kofi replied. "You, my son, have lost the privilege to dictate terms." Danso's body trembled as he surged to his feet, rage coursing through him. He lunged toward his father, fury blazing in his eyes, but his advance was stopped by two guards who stepped in, gripping his arms tightly. "Wamba's life is in your hands, Danso," King Kofi continued, unaffected by his son's fury. "The only thing standing between him and whatever fate I deem is your willingness to comply." Danso fought against the guard's hold, his chest heaving with labored breaths. He wanted to scream, to break free, to tear apart the smirk on his father's face. But the sight of the bloodied shirt, the knowledge of what Wamba might be enduring, broke something in him. The strength seeped out of his body, leaving him limp, defeated, as the guards released him. He slumped back to the floor, his eyes never leaving the shirt. "I'll do it," he whispered, his voice laden with resignation. "I agree to your terms. Just let him go." A small, triumphant smile curved on King Kofi's lips as he stepped closer. "Wise choice." He turned to leave, but Danso's voice, low and unsteady, stopped him. "Papa," Danso began, his words slow, each syllable soaked in unfiltered pain. "You can make me marry 10 wives, have 100 children. You can twist my life however you want, but you will never change who I am. I am a boy who loves other boys. I love their strength, the firmness of their hands against mine, solid and grounding. I love the rumble of their voices, low and sure, steadying everything inside me. King Kofi's face grew stormy, but Danso continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. I love Wamba. I love the way he sees me, the way he makes me feel. I love every piece of him, every look, every smile, every whispered word. You can force me to marry, but in my heart, I will always belong to him. And when you die, which I hope is soon, I will marry Wamba. I will move him into your bedroom and I will make love to him every night on your bed, and together we will rule what remains of your kingdom. King Kofi's face contorted with fury, a rage that seemed to burn through his cold, stoic exterior. His hands clenched, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned sharply and stormed from the room, his final words echoing like a curse. The wedding is in 3 days. As the door slammed shut, Danso fell to his knees, his body racked with silent sobs, the bloodied shirt clutched tightly in his trembling hands. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment below. Your thoughts help me make this channel better every day.